Hi, boys and girls. I hope you've had a good day so far. So, yesterday we finished our chapter book, Freckle Juice by Judy Blume, and on Monday we're going to start a new chapter book. But today I'm going to read a funny picture book that I think you guys will enjoy about a class who has picture day, but something goes a little wrong. So, we're going to go ahead and read to find out what happens. The title of our story is Mrs. Toggle's Class Picture Day, and this story is written by, if I don't drop it, this story is written by Robin Pulver. As soon as Mrs. Toggle's children walked into their classroom in the morning, they ran right back out. "Yikes!" yelled Joey. "What was that?" cried Caroline. The creature in their room came right after them. "Children, it's me, your teacher, Mrs. Toggle. I'm having a really bad hair day." The children lowered their hands from their faces. "It's Mrs. Toggle, all right," said Nina. "But we shouldn't stare," said Caroline. "Bad hair day," said Joey. "It's more like a bad scare day." "I thought it was a nightmare day," agreed Dina. "Paul said it will be a nightmare if we can't review subtraction for our test." "Uh-oh," said Caroline. "It's school picture day." "That's right," said Mrs. Toggle. "I can't have my picture looking like this." "Maybe we can help," said Caroline. "It's worth a try," said Mrs. Toggle. The children used paper clips and rubber bands on Mrs. Toggle's hair. They patted and sprayed and taped. They glittered and glued. But when they were done, Mrs. Toggle's hair was still bad. The principal, Mr. Stickler, stepped in. "Mrs. Toggle, is that you?" he asked. "What was all the shouting about?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Stickler," said Mrs. Toggle. "The noise was my fault. I scared the children. I'm having a bad hair day." "I have never heard of such a thing," said the principal. "But if your hair is being bad, you must bring it to my office for time out. You come too. I suppose your hair is attached to you." "We're attached to Mrs. Toggle too," said Caroline. "We love our teacher, even when she's scary." "Besides," said Paul, "we need to review subtraction for our test." So Mrs. Toggle's hair headed for the principal's office. Mrs. Toggle went along with it, and so did Mrs. Toggle's students. Mrs. Toggle sat down with her hair in the timeout chair. But Mrs. Toggle's hair didn't stop being bad. It didn't settle down one bit. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Toggle. "Now I'm having a bad chair day as well as a bad hair day." The custodian, Mr. Abel, walked in. "Mrs. Toggle," he said, "is that you? Your hair, it looks, it just looks, great." "There's no need to be polite, Mr. Abel," said Mrs. Toggle. "I'm having a bad hair day." "Hey, Mr. Abel," said Dina, "you can fix anything. Could you repair Mrs. Toggle's hair?" "Oh, yes, please," begged Paul, "so we can get busy reviewing subtraction for our test." "And so she'll look good for school pictures," said Nina. Mr. Abel scratched his head. "I use a blow dryer to fix my own hair, but there are no blow dryers at school. I'll try to think of something else. Meanwhile, Mrs. Toggle, why don't you go see the nurse? When I have a bad back, I take medicine. Maybe Mrs. Scott has medicine for bad hair." So Mr. Stickler gave Mrs. Toggle permission to take her hair to the nurse's office. "I'm glad I never have bad hair," he said. "You don't have much hair at all," declared Caroline. "It's been subtracted from your head," observed Paul. "That's right," said Mr. Stickler. "My head is perfect. Perfect heads don't need hair to cover them up." He's being funny. At the nurse's office, Mrs. Scott took one look at Mrs. Toggle and shrieked, "Mrs. Toggle, what bad hair you have!" "I know," said Mrs. Toggle. "We're hoping you have medicine for it." "To make it settle down," explained Nina. "Like Mr. Abel's bad back sometimes," added Dina. Mrs. Scott shook her head. "I have no medicine for bad hair, but just in case bad hair is catching, you had better wear a mask." Mrs. Scott put a mask over Mrs. Toggle's mouth and nose to keep bad hair germs from spreading to others. How can she teach subtraction with her mouth covered like that? Asked Paul. I will look ridiculous for school pictures, muttered Mrs. Toggle. It's the best I can do, said Mrs. Scott. But why don't you go to the art room? Maybe Mrs. Doodle can help you. The art teacher, Mrs. Doodle, was hanging finger paintings up to dry. Mrs. Toggle, exclaimed Mrs. Doodle. It's not your day for art, is it? And what in the world have you done to your hair? She's having a bad hair day, explained Nina. We thought you could make her more beautiful for school pictures, said Dina. That is great, exclaimed Mrs. Doodle. I will use my imagination. But Mrs. Toggle, why are you wearing that ugly mask? So she won't spread bad hair germs, said Dina. If bad hair is catching. Oh, said Mrs. Doodle. I can make the mask look better, too. She painted polka dots on it. Then she said, and now for my masterpiece. Mrs. Doodle fluffed and flipped and pushed and poofed, and she added color here and color there, lots of color everywhere. There, she said at last. Children, how did I do? Mrs. Doodle, said Nina, we don't want to hurt your feelings, but our teacher's hair is still bad, said Caroline. It's worse than ever, blurted out Joey. Well, said Mrs. Doodle, some people don't appreciate fine art when they see it. Mrs. Toggle, suggested Dina, let's take your hair to the library. Maybe it would settle down for a story. What do you think Miss Toggle looks like? The children asked the librarian, Mr. Page, to read them a story. A quiet story, explained Caroline. It's good for calming things down. Namely, Mrs. Toggle's hair, said Joey. You've come to the right place, said Mr. Page. He chose a book and began to read. His voice was calm and quiet, soft and soothing. Soon Mrs. Toggle and her class were sprawled on the floor, sound asleep. When they woke up, Mrs. Toggle's hair was smushed on one side and standing up on the other. Mrs. Toggle yawned. You read that beautifully, Mr. Page, but my hair is still bad. Uh-oh, said Caroline. It's time for school pictures. Mrs. Toggle and her class headed for the auditorium. Oh, where is Mr. Abel with that blow dryer? Asked Mrs. Toggle. There he is, said Nina. He doesn't have a blow dryer. He has a... What do you think he's going to have? What's similar to a blow dryer that they might have in a school? A fan, shouted everybody. Suddenly, everybody's hair was bad, except for Mr. Stickler's. Sorry, Mrs. Toggle, said Mr. Abel. I guess that was too much air for your bad hair. That's quite all right, Mr. Abel, exclaimed Mrs. Toggle. In fact, I'm forever grateful. Now I'm not the only one with bad hair. A few weeks later, when the pictures were ready, Mrs. Scott took one look and shouted, I was afraid bad hair was catching. Paul put his picture up on his refrigerator at home. Who cares about bad hair, he said. At least I passed subtraction. And that was the class picture. I hope you enjoyed that picture book. It was funny. I always enjoy it when I read it. I will see you on Monday for our new chapter book. We will be reading Nate the Great, which I think you guys will enjoy. It's like a little mystery story for kids. I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. I miss you and love you so much, and I will see you on Monday for our new chapter book and our next Read Aloud. Bye.